Why don't you stay with us for this next discussion on how various businesses and groups in the U.S. are handling the rhetoric surrounding the aftermath of the Hamas terror attacks and Israel's ensuing war. In the Hollywood community, the New York Times details how some Jewish leaders are saying that industry leaders are not doing enough to condemn the Hamas attack on October 7th. A senior rabbi in Los Angeles told the paper, quote, after October 7th, it wouldn't have been hard for people to put out statements that said under no circumstances is rape or murder or kidnapping of civilians acceptable. And we need to work toward a just future for Jews and Palestinians in Israel and Palestine. But that's not what happened, the rabbi said. And so as a result, a lot of people are shocked and afraid. This is a great example of how silence actually makes things worse in some ways, or saying the wrong thing, obviously. Joining us now, co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. And Lauren, you're also the founder of Leader Shivet Advisors, which advises companies on communications as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's actually a very timely topic for you because this is a minefield for companies. It's difficult, but I also want to ask why and what are you hearing? What are the questions they have for you? What is the advice you give to them?
Yeah, so immediately after the October 7th attacks, hundreds of companies put out statements condemning the violence, condemning Hamas. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, the professor at Yale, has been tracking it. He's got about 150 companies on the list, just as he did after the George Floyd attacks. But what's happened is this sort of impossible quandary in a sense. So the immediate response to many of the corporations and the CEO statements, especially by Jewish employees, was that it wasn't enough, that they many hadn't explicitly condemned Hamas, explicitly condemned terrorism.
Right.
There are Slack groups that popped up at lots of companies, Jewish Slack groups of employees sort of decrying what they felt was a lack of courage from their CEOs. But what happened is that quickly afterwards, there was backlash from the other side. And Palestinian Arab employees distressed that their CEOs were taking a position, a pro-Israel position. Starbucks, I mean, Andrew can talk about this, but Starbucks wound up suing a group of employees in their union for making essentially a pro-Palestine statement. So the biggest issue here is that companies for the last decade have been trying to navigate these big, complicated issues from abortion to race to now the war in Israel. And they're mostly really poorly equipped to do it. And they're sort of losing on all sides.
It just seems to me that two things sometimes can be true at the same time. Go ahead, Elise.
It's difficult to have nuance in a quick press release. What are the CEOs that you're talking to, what are they saying about how they are factoring in public opinion or not? Or are they following their moral compass, whatever direction that goes?
You know, I think not enough companies have really established a set of clear parameters about when, where, why, and how they're going to speak on major issues. And so every time these things happen, they wind up in sort of immediate crisis communications mode. There's no question that it was imperative, especially for companies that have operations and employees in Israel, to speak out against the attacks of Hamas. And just on a human level, I mean, it's sort of inconceivable. And I think it was very distressing, especially for American Jews, when the leaders of their own institutions refused to condemn the horrific attacks and, frankly, the continuing scourge of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I think that's the right answer, just as President Biden did. But interestingly, CEOs are facing the same kind of backlash that President Biden did, which is that he came out in strong support of Israel. What happened? The Arab American community in places like Michigan and elsewhere threatened to no longer support him. So there is this ongoing question of sort of moral clarity, but also the ability to do two things at once, as you say, to be able to speak out about the humanitarian crisis, which no one denies is horrific, but also to be honest about the very real threats against Jews here and around the world and how just absolutely appalling the attacks were.
Well, I think, Andrew Ross Sorkin, I'd love to hear what you're hearing in the business community about this, and if there are also issues with some companies or entities that needed to say something that took too long.
Well, you know, there were so many CEOs, I would say, during the Trump administration, and not to make this political, but during that period that spoke out on so many issues. And then there was what they thought of as a backlash. That backlash came, by the way, in large part because they looked at things that were happening in Florida, for example, with Governor DeSantis, and they saw it affecting their business. And so everybody has gone quiet. And I think that quiet is now what we're talking about. There are CEOs, you're right, in the midst of all of this that have come out with those statements that Jeff Sonnenfeld is keeping that tally on. But at the same time, you know, there have not been, anti-Semitism seminars that are taking place at corporations. We have that built into the curriculum, if you will, now. That's part of so many different DEI programs inside companies. But anti-Semitism is not part of that and has not been implemented in that kind of way. And you're right. The question is, can they speak out directly about anti-Semitism? These folks out there that are saying genocide to the Jews, I mean, just terrible, horrific things. Can you speak out about that, and yet at the same time, and this is the nuanced piece of it, can you have a nuanced conversation about the policy in Israel, how the approach is taken towards Palestine, and do people see those things with any distinction or clarity? And that I think is what has made this so very difficult for the CEO community.
Yeah. CNBC's Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you so much. And co-founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. Thank you both for being on this morning.